Okay, so a club just agreed to pay another club more money for the rights to a 23-year-old signature than most people will earn across several lifetimes, and the player himself will not see a single dollar of that headline number directly. Transfer fees are one of the strangest financial mechanisms in all of professional sports, a market where the asset being purchased is not a piece of property or a company. It is the remaining years on a human being's employment contract, and the price attached to it can swing by tens of millions of dollars based on nothing more than the number of months left before that contract expires. Here is what the unveiling photo, player holding a scarf in front of a stadium, does not show you. A payment structure spread across years, laden with conditional clauses that may never actually trigger. A release clause system that functions less like a price tag and more like a legal escape hatch written years in advance. And a market so volatile that the exact same player at the exact same level of ability can be worth 10 times more or 10 times less, depending purely on timing. Before we talk about the fee itself, we need to understand what a transfer fee actually represents, because it is fundamentally different from buying a piece of equipment or even acquiring another company. A football player under contract is bound to his club for a fixed term, and that club holds the exclusive right to that player's services for the remaining duration of the agreement. A transfer fee is, in essence, compensation paid to release a player from that existing contractual obligation early so he can sign a new one elsewhere. This single structural fact explains almost every strange behavior in the transfer market, because the value of releasing someone from a contract depends enormously on how much contract is actually left to release him from. This is where the concept of amortization enters the picture, and it is the accounting mechanism that makes modern transfer economics function the way they do. When a club pays a transfer fee, that cost is not recorded as a single expense in the year the deal happens. Instead, accounting rules require the fee to be spread, or amortized, evenly across the length of the contract the player signs with his new club. A fee paid for a player signing a 5-year deal gets divided into 5 equal annual charges against the club's finances, meaning the true annual cost of a transfer is the total fee divided by contract length, not the headline number that gets reported in the news the day the deal is announced. This is precisely why clubs increasingly favor signing players to longer contracts, even when the player's peak performance years might realistically be shorter. A 6-year contract on paper reduces the annual accounting cost of an enormous fee, even though it also means carrying that same player's wages on the books for years after his form may have started declining. A trade-off that has caused real financial pain for several major clubs who structured deals this way, only to find the player's performance fell off well before the contract's accounting benefit expired. Now let's talk about how a fee actually gets set in the first place, because unlike almost any conventional market, there is no fixed price list, and the mechanism that determines value is built almost entirely around remaining contract time and a specific legal tool called a release clause. Some player contracts include a predetermined figure written into the agreement itself that any club can trigger to secure that player's signature, regardless of whether the current club wants to sell. This clause exists specifically to protect a player's freedom of movement while still guaranteeing his current club a minimum compensation if he leaves. And the number attached to it is usually set deliberately high during peak career years, specifically to discourage rivals from attempting to trigger it casually. For players without one, the fee becomes a negotiation entirely shaped by leverage, and leverage in this market is almost entirely a function of time remaining on the existing deal. Here is the mechanism that creates the single largest source of volatility in the entire transfer market, and it explains why the exact same player can be valued so differently within a short window. A player with several years remaining on his contract gives his current club enormous negotiating leverage because the buying club has no alternative path to acquiring him other than paying whatever fee the selling club demands. But as a contract approaches its final year, that leverage inverts dramatically. A club risks losing a player for literally nothing, zero transfer fee, if they allow his contract to expire without securing a new agreement or a sale. Because once a contract ends, the player becomes what the industry calls a free agent, entitled to negotiate with any club and sign without any transfer fee obligation whatsoever, with only the player's own new salary and often a substantial signing bonus paid directly to him and his representatives as the cost of acquisition. This creates enormous pressure on selling clubs to cash in on a valuable asset well before that final year, frequently accepting a fee below what the player would have commanded years earlier, purely because the alternative, watching the value evaporate to zero through the natural expiration of a contract, is financially far worse. This dynamic has produced some of the most dramatic value swings in the sport's financial history. A player entering the final year of his contract with no signed extension in sight can see his transfer value collapse to a fraction of what it would have commanded 18 months earlier, purely because every buying club recognizes the selling club's weakening negotiating position and simply waits, knowing that either a discounted fee or an entirely free transfer is likely to become available soon. Conversely, a club that successfully extends a star player's contract during his peak years, adding several fresh seasons of team control, can see that same player's valuation climb substantially, not because his footballing ability changed at all, but purely because the remaining contract length, the actual asset being priced, increased. Now let's talk about where the actual fee money goes once a deal is completed, because there is a persistent misconception that transfer fees function like player salaries. They do not. The transfer fee is paid entirely to the selling club as compensation for releasing the player from his contract, not to the player himself. The player's financial benefit from a transfer comes through an entirely separate negotiation, his new wage at the buying club, and often a signing bonus paid directly to him as part of agreeing to the move. This separation explains why player agents negotiate two almost entirely distinct financial conversations during any transfer: the fee between the two clubs, which the agent has limited direct influence over beyond facilitating discussions, and the personal terms between the player and his new employer, which is where an agent's commission, typically calculated as a percentage of the player's new contract value, is actually earned. This is also why agent fees themselves have become a significant and often controversial line item in modern football finance, with top agents commanding percentages on some of the largest deals in the sport that run into the tens of millions of dollars for facilitating a single move. There is also a payment structure detail that rarely makes headlines, but significantly affects how transfer fees actually function financially. Reported transfer fees frequently include a base amount paid up front or across an agreed installment schedule, plus additional conditional payments tied to performance triggers, appearances played, goals scored, trophies won, or even the player's future international recognition. These add-on clauses mean the headline fee reported when a deal is announced is often a ceiling figure representing the maximum possible total payment, not a guaranteed amount. And selling clubs have learned to build these conditional structures specifically to make deals appear larger in public reporting, while giving buying clubs genuine downside protection if the player's career does not develop as hoped. A significant share of these conditional payments across the industry as a whole are never actually triggered, meaning the true aggregate cost of many high-profile transfers ends up meaningfully below the number that dominated headlines on deadline day. Let's build the two honest scenarios, because a single transfer decision can define a club's finances for years afterward in either direction. The good outcome: a club signs a talented young player with several years remaining on his previous contract, paying a substantial fee but securing a long contract at the new club that locks in below market wages relative to his eventual peak performance level. The player develops into a genuine star over the following seasons. His amortized annual cost on the books remains fixed regardless of his rising performance and market value, and the club benefits from a period of elite production at a controlled, predictable cost, functionally identical to the rookie contract advantage we discussed in professional basketball, just achieved through a different mechanism. If that player is eventually sold years later, often for a fee well above what was originally paid, the club realizes a substantial capital gain on the transaction, having captured both years of elite on-field performance below market cost and a profitable eventual resale. The single most financially efficient outcome the entire system is designed to reward. The harder outcome, and one that has become increasingly common as transfer fees across the sport have climbed to historic levels. A club pays a substantial fee for a player who fails to adapt to a new league, new tactical system, or new level of competition, producing well below the level his fee and salary would suggest. The annual amortized cost continues appearing on the club's finances, regardless of underperformance, occupying a wage budget slot and squad spot that cannot be easily reallocated until the contract's term expires, or the club accepts a substantial loss, selling the player at a fraction of what was originally paid, a well-documented phenomenon across the industry that has led to some of the largest write-downs in football finance history. Players whose remaining book value on a club's accounts had to be formally reduced because the realistic resale value had fallen so far below the amortized cost still being carried. That gap, a below-market superstar anchoring years of elite performance on one side versus an expensive underperforming asset that must eventually be sold at a loss on the other, sitting entirely on a projection of how a young player's ability translates to a new league, new pressure, and new expectations, mirrors almost exactly the volatility we examined in professional basketball's draft system, just conducted through negotiation between clubs rather than a lottery. The mechanism differs, contract leverage and negotiated fees instead of predetermined draft position, but the underlying risk, paying a large fixed cost today based on an uncertain projection of tomorrow's performance, is structurally identical. There is one more layer worth understanding, because it explains why the largest clubs in the world increasingly behave less like sports teams, making individual purchasing decisions, and more like sophisticated financial institutions, managing a portfolio of appreciating and depreciating assets simultaneously. The most successful clubs financially are frequently not the ones who simply spend the most on transfer fees, but the ones who have built systematic scouting and player development infrastructure capable of identifying undervalued young talent before their contract leverage inverts against the selling club, developing that talent internally or through smart early acquisition, and either integrating them into a winning squad at a fraction of peak market cost, or selling them on for substantial profit once their value has appreciated. This trading function, buying low on projected talent and selling high on proven performance, has become as central to many clubs' financial sustainability as ticket sales, broadcast revenue, or sponsorship income, an entire secondary business operating underneath the sport itself. So does the transfer fee system actually work as a value-generating mechanism for the clubs operating within it? The honest answer is that it rewards, disproportionately, the clubs with the scouting infrastructure, financial patience, and negotiating discipline to buy contract years while they are still cheap and sell them before that same leverage flips against them. The fee itself, however large the headline number, is never really a price paid for a player's talent in the abstract. It is a price paid for a very specific, very perishable asset, the remaining time on a contract before it runs out entirely, and the value it represents evaporates to zero. And understanding that single mechanism explains almost every seemingly irrational transfer decision that dominates the sport's headlines every single window.